Tonight, when you go to bed, you'll probably sleep alone, or maybe next to one other person, and that will feel completely normal to you. But for 300,000 years, that arrangement would have looked insane to every single one of your ancestors. Because for almost the entirety of human history, sleeping alone wasn't just unusual. It was one of the most dangerous things a person could do. Entire families, entire clans, sometimes 20 or 30 people, packed into a single space every single night, bodies touching, breathing the same air, sharing the same fire. And it wasn't a matter of comfort or culture. It was survival. So what happened? Why did we go from sleeping in piles of bodies to sleeping alone in separate rooms, sometimes in separate houses entirely? The answer touches on predators, disease, childhood development, and a psychological shift so recent that your own grandparents probably experienced part of it. Let's start with the obvious threat: predators. For most of human evolutionary history, night was not survivable alone. Our ancestors had terrible night vision compared to the animals hunting them. Leopards, hyenas, saber-toothed cats, all of them could see in near total darkness. A solitary human at night wasn't just vulnerable, they were an easy meal. Anthropologist Carol Worthman, who has spent decades studying sleep across cultures, found that in virtually every hunter-gatherer society ever documented, people slept in close physical groups, often within arm's reach of each other. Precisely because a solitary sleeper had almost no chance of surviving an ambush. Sleeping in a pile wasn't just about warmth. It was a defense system. More eyes, even closed ones, meant more ears listening for danger, more bodies to raise an alarm, more targets to confuse a predator deciding who to attack first. If you slept apart from the group, you were choosing to be the easiest kill in the camp. But it wasn't only predators. Fire needed constant tending, and this shaped sleep architecture in ways we rarely think about. In nearly every documented hunter-gatherer society, someone was awake at almost every hour of the night, keeping the fire alive, because a fire that went out meant darkness. And darkness meant vulnerability returned instantly. Researchers studying the Hadza of Tanzania, one of the last populations on Earth still living a hunting and foraging lifestyle, found that across any given night there was almost never a moment when every single person in the camp was asleep at the same time. Someone was always stirring, tending the fire, listening. Sleep wasn't a private, individual event the way we experience it now. It was a shared, rotating watch distributed across an entire group, unconsciously coordinated night after night. This brings us to something researchers call the safe sleep hypothesis, developed largely through the work of sleep anthropologist Carol Worthman and later expanded by psychologist David Sampson. The idea is simple but radical. Human sleep didn't just happen to occur in groups. Human sleep architecture itself, the way we cycle through light sleep, deep sleep, and REM sleep throughout the night, may have evolved specifically because we always expected to sleep in a group. In 2017, David Sampson led a study comparing sleep patterns of the Hadza to modern industrialized populations. He found that Hadza sleep was lighter and more fragmented than typical Western sleep, but crucially, this wasn't a sign of poor sleep. It was adaptive. Multiple people sleeping lightly and waking briefly throughout the night created a constantly shifting, overlapping watch system without anyone consciously organizing it. Sampson called this poor sleep a misnomer entirely. He argued that what looks like fragmented, low-quality sleep by modern medical standards might actually be exactly what a socially embedded predator avoiding sleep system should look like. In other words, the deep, uninterrupted 8-hour block of solitary sleep that we consider the gold standard today might be the biological anomaly, not the historical human sleep pattern, and there's a reason this group's sleeping pattern went far beyond simple defense. It shaped how human infants developed, in ways modern parenting has almost completely reversed. For virtually all of human history, infants slept in direct physical contact with a caregiver, usually the mother, sometimes passed between multiple adults through the night. This wasn't a preference. It was quite literally a matter of life and death. Human infants are born extraordinarily underdeveloped compared to other primates. largely because our skulls have to fit through a narrowed pelvis shaped by walking upright. This means human babies are born with brains that are only about 25% of their adult size compared to a chimpanzee, whose brain at birth is already 40% of its adult size. Anthropologists sometimes call human infants extrogestates, meaning they essentially need to keep developing outside the womb almost as if pregnancy continued for several more months. And a huge part of that ongoing development depended on constant physical contact. James McKenna, a biological anthropologist at Notre Dame who has spent his entire career studying infant sleep, discovered something remarkable when he began monitoring mothers and infants sleeping together versus sleeping apart. When infants slept in close contact with their mothers, their breathing patterns, heart rates, and even body temperatures synchronized with the mothers. McKenna called this phenomenon biological regulation, and he argued that a sleeping infant essentially uses the mother's body as an external life support system through the night. Infant breathing, in particular, is not fully mature at birth. Newborns experience brief pauses in breathing called apneas, dozens of times a night. McKenna's research suggested that a mother's proximity, her breathing sounds, her movements, even the carbon dioxide she exhaled, acted as a kind of biological alarm clock, subtly nudging the infant's nervous system to keep breathing regularly. Infants sleeping completely alone, McKenna argued, were missing this constant external regulation, precisely during the most fragile developmental window of their entire lives. This matters enormously, because starting in the mid-20th century, Western parenting advice did something that had never happened at scale in the entire history of our species. It told parents to put infants to sleep alone, in separate rooms, away from any physical contact. In the 1940s and 1950s, pediatricians like Dr. Luther Emmett Holt and later child care experts began promoting the idea that infants needed to learn independence early, and that sleeping with a child would create unhealthy dependence. This advice spread rapidly through American and European culture, becoming standard practice within a couple of generations. But this recommendation had almost no basis in evolutionary biology. It emerged not from studying what infants actually needed physiologically, but from cultural assumptions about discipline, self-reliance, and what a modern household should look like. McKenna's research decades later suggested this shift may have contributed to rising rates of certain infant health complications, though the topic remains genuinely debated among researchers. And public health guidance today focuses on room sharing without bed sharing as a safer middle ground. Regardless of where the science ultimately lands, one thing is clear: solitary infant sleep is an extremely recent invention, existing for perhaps 80 years out of a 300,000-year history where infants had never, not once, slept fully alone. So if group sleeping was the norm for almost the entirety of human existence, what actually broke the pattern for adults? The answer, somewhat surprisingly, has more to do with architecture and social class than with any biological shift at all. For most of history, even after humans settled into permanent villages and cities, private bedrooms simply didn't exist for the vast majority of people. Historian A. Roger Eckerk, whose research also uncovered the phenomenon of segmented sleep, found that in medieval Europe, entire families and often visiting travelers or servants routinely shared a single bed or a single room, regardless of blood relation. Beds were expensive, houses were small. Privacy, as we understand it today, was almost entirely a luxury reserved for nobility. Eckerk documented records showing that inns commonly placed unrelated strangers in the same bed simply because there weren't enough beds to go around, and this was considered completely unremarkable. Sleeping alone wasn't a sign of independence. It was, in most cases, a sign that you couldn't afford anything else, or that something was wrong with you. The shift toward private, solitary sleep tracked almost exactly with the rise of the middle class and the spread of larger homes. Eckerk's research shows that private bedrooms began appearing in wealthier European households around the 17th and 18th centuries, but they remained rare for ordinary people well into the 19th century. It was really the industrial era, with mass-produced housing, factory-driven urbanization, and a growing middle class with disposable income, that made separate bedrooms achievable for large segments of the population for the first time in human history. And alongside that architectural shift came a cultural one. Enlightenment-era philosophy increasingly emphasized the individual over the collective. privacy stopped being simply unaffordable and started being framed as morally desirable, a sign of respectability.